After the atomic bombs fell on Japan, the history of warfare was changed forever. Now, with the use of a single bomb, a whole city could be destroyed if launched correctly. The other countries at the same time saw this power of a new weapon and wanted it for themselves, especially the Soviet Union, which might be strange because without the help of American industry and Land-Lease aid, the Soviets would have lost the war. But to understand how this was even possible, we need to start at the beginning. In January 1939, German scientists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann published their discovery of nuclear fission. The announcements prompted fears among exiled scientists that Germany might be able to build an atomic bomb. A British reporter from the MAUD committee in January 1941 concluded a bomb was genuinely feasible, and after it reached the US, Roosevelt authorized expediting the work that October. Then Pearl Harbor happened, which accelerated everything, and by February 1942, the metallurgical laboratory was set up at the University of Chicago to study chain reactions in the newly created element plutonium. Enrico Fermi's team there would go on to produce Chicago Power 1, the first self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction, that December. The project was officially created on August 13, 1942, and the name the Manhattan Project comes from the fact that its first offices were literally on the Broadway in Manhattan. It needed a single commander to bring order to a sprawling, secretive, multi-site effort, and on September 17, 1942, Colonel Leslie Groves, an Army engineer who had just overseen construction of the Pentagon, was appointed director of the Manhattan Engineering District. Groves knew he wasn't a scientist himself, so he brought in Oppenheimer as a scientific director, and the team soon settled on Los Alamos, New Mexico, as a site for the weapons laboratory. But this operation needed a large amount of people to keep it running, but at the same time it needed to be kept secretive to avoid leaks. That's where a man named George Abramovich Koval came into the picture. To understand how he got there, let's look at his childhood. George was born in Sioux City on Christmas Day 1913 to Abraham and Ethel. Both of his parents held socialist convictions they passed down to George and his two brothers. Abraham specifically arrived in Sioux City in 1910 after leaving Brussels, having faced certain restrictions. His father was by all accounts a carpenter. From an early age, George had already shown early communist leanings, participating in a communist youth gathering in Chicago, and getting arrested while advocating for people impoverished by the Depression. Neighbors later recalled that George spoke openly about his communist beliefs. This detail would be a foreshadowing event years before anyone would ever think to wonder why. George didn't all of a sudden get into later in life. He grew up in a household where his father was literally organizing immigration to the USSR. And by his teens, George was already getting arrested for left-wing activism. This will be an important detail on why he was chosen in the future. He graduated Central High School in 1929. By every account, he was gifted in education. He was in the National Honor Society during these years. He went on to join the Young Communist League and served as a delegate to the Communist Party in Iowa Convention in August 1930. The Great Depression hit the family hard, and by the early 1930s, the ICOR was actively promoting immigration to the newly created Jewish Autonomous Region in the Soviet Far East. The Kovals made the decision to leave. So in 1932, the family decided to immigrate to the USSR to settle in Birobidzhan, joining a collective farm there. George now was around 18 and just short of finishing his chemistry coursework, but not all was well. The family's arrival in the USSR didn't go as planned. They intended to settle with relatives in Minsk, but Soviet authorities didn't allow it. Instead, they were routed to the Far East, near the Manchurian border. Abram put his carpentry skills to use, building and repairing houses for the commune. George's older brother, Isaiah, became a tractor driver, eventually marrying a woman from Kiev and raising 4 children there. George spent this period improving his Russian, which by most accounts had been weaker than his English, and taught himself to repair farm machinery, eventually becoming the collective's primary mechanic, and by several accounts, one of the most capable members in general. But before I moved there, there's also a nice irony worth using. The family was profiled by an American communist newspaper, whose journalist, Paul Novak, wrote that they had traded the uncertainty of life as small shopkeepers for a worry-free existence for themselves and their children. Given what we know now about the hardship of the collective farm and the family's actual trajectory, that propaganda framing reads very differently in hindsight. The collective life didn't hold George for long, By most accounts, he found it unfulfilling, and in 1934 he applied and was accepted at the Institute of Chemical Technology in Moscow, which meant leaving the family and the collective behind. There he specialized in rare gases and met a fellow student named Lyudmila Ivanova. He married her and graduated with honors in 1939. His academic record was strong enough that the State Examination Board waived the usual post-grad entrance exam and recommended him directly for further study, and it's this recommendation, plus his American background, that put him on the GRU's radar shortly after. The exact recruitment mechanics stay murky, but the shape of it is documented. Recruitment happened around 1938, and while George was finishing his post-grad work, a GRU representative contacted the Institute directly and inquired about him. The Institute's director reported that George was an exceptional student who worked hard and was making excellent progress studying inorganic substances, and noted that he was also politically developed, having been a member of the All-Union Lenin Communist Youth League since 1936. So the GRU's process ran through two channels simultaneously: academic excellence, verified by his professors, and ideological reliability, verified by his political record. That combination is exactly what a recruiting service screening for a long-term, deep-cover asset would want. The opportunity the GRU had was rare. Here was a man who was an American citizen, born and raised in the US, and fluent in both English and Russian, while also possessing the scientific and technical skills needed for intelligence work on weapons projects. Just as important was what he lacked. Unlike most Soviet assets in America, he had emerged through no connection to the American Communist Party, so he was barely known to other party comrades and untainted by the sloppy trade work that compromised many of them. That's a specific detail. The GRU wanted someone with zero footprint in the existing espionage network of the American left. He was trained to blend back into American life, and in September 1940 he arrived in San Francisco and made his way to New York City. By January of the next year, where then a GRU officer with an already established network took over as his handler. To build a legitimate cover, he enrolled in chemistry classes at Columbia University. That fall, which happened to put him at one of the exact institutions during early atomic research the Soviets were starting to watch. In New York, he became deputy commander of the local GRU cell, operating under the cover of a company called Raven Electric, a real supplier to firms like General Electric. He told co-workers and classmates that he was a native New Yorker and was an only child, and by all accounts he was likable and integrating. George registered for the draft on January 2, 1941, barely months after arriving, and Raven Electric secured him a job related deferment starting in February. The reason is a good detail. His GRU handlers wanted that deferment specifically because being drafted would interfere with his chemical weapons collection work. So being drafted wasn't something his handlers wanted, yet they were actively trying to keep him a civilian. Once it expired, he was inducted into the Army on February 4, 1943. He went through basic training at Fort Dix, New Jersey, then to Citadel in Charleston, South Carolina, before being admitted on August 11 to the Army Specialized Training Program. This is a unit built to give talented enlistees technical education, where he studied electrical engineering at City College of New York. He reportedly scored a 152 on the Army's classification test, which is very good, and this will put him on the radar for more specialized assignments. In August 1944, George was selected for the Army Special Engineering Detachment and was transferred toward Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Before he left, he met with his Soviet contact, Faraday, and reported the existence of a secret nuclear city at Oak Ridge that was producing uranium-235 and plutonium-239, telling him the enrichment work was split across the three main reactors, K25, Y12, and X10, and that once enough enriched material was produced, it was flown by military plane to Los Alamos. That's an important detail. He was reporting the site's existence and layout to Moscow before he'd even stepped foot there, meaning either GRU had other resources or he already picked up intel through his network. Less than a week after that meeting, he arrived at Oak Ridge. He was made a health physics officer, a position that carried top secret clearance. The job itself is what made him dangerous. Health physics staff monitored radiation contamination across the entire surrounding region, sometimes as far as 75-mile radius. which meant George was free to roam, virtually, the whole installation, with a legitimate reason to be anywhere. He had his own jeep, drove himself between the three main nuclear fuel plants, and was living in SED barracks, eating the same cafeteria as the military police. As a health physics officer, this access let him observe production volumes, processes, and site layouts firsthand. He then reconstructed what he had seen from memory when he met with his handler, rather than physically removing classified paperwork from a secure facility, which would have been far riskier and far more likely to get him caught. A colleague who had worked in a different Oak Ridge lab, Arnold Carmish, later said George was, quote, one of the very few people who had access to the entire program, end quote. George also built real professional credibility while there. He impressed his managers by researching and writing a genuine scientific paper called Determination of Projectile Airborne Long-Lived Activity, drafted in January 1945 and circulated to fellow scientists that June. So he wasn't just pretending to work, he was doing real and respected work as his cover. Since he had access to the Y-12 and K-25 plants, he knew both where enriching uranium went into fusionable U-235 for one of the two bomb designs, and he almost certainly reported this to his handler, that the Hanford reactors were producing ample plutonium for the second bomb, while Oak Ridge struggled to keep pace on uranium. His handler specifically tasked him with tracking Oak Ridge's polonium supply, since scientists had discovered reactor-produced plutonium alone was too unstable to trigger the necessary chain reaction, and plutonium-based initiators were needed instead. He passed that intelligence to a Soviet contact known as, quote, Clyde, reaching Moscow through coded dispatches, couriers, and Soviet embassy. Among what he sent, that Oak Ridge's plutonium was being shipped onward to Los Alamos. On July 16, 1945, the initiator technology he was reporting on passed its real-world test, the first atomic bomb detonated at the Trinity site in New Mexico. That success is what gave U.S. planners confidence to build a plutonium implosion bomb alongside the uranium gun Type 1. On June 27th, almost a year at Oak Ridge, George was transferred to a top-secret laboratory in Dayton, Ohio. This is widely regarded as his most damaging assignment, since it's where the polonium initiator itself went into production. During his time there, he was assigned to the health physics branch of the medical department there, with even greater access than he had had at Oak Ridge. He and his roommate lived openly, in civilian clothes, and George joined a bowling league and dated a young local woman. Ordinary American social life layered directly on top of active espionage. Then in December, he reported to Moscow that the Americans were producing polonium for the bomb project and gave the monthly production volume at Oak Ridge. Between 1945 and early 46, he met regularly with his comrade, Clyde, to hand over detailed information on the Dayton polonium work. And by February, Moscow had reportedly received a full outline of the American polonium production process, itself a report that the GRU logged on February 13, 1946. Historians have since called his explanation of the industrial process one that genuinely mattered to the arms race. Since the Soviets' earlier efforts had relied on a cruder radium-beryllium alternative, in February, George received an honorable discharge from the Army as part of a general demobilization, earning 2 service medals. He then turned a job offer from Monsanto and instead finished his electrical engineering degree at CCNY, staying in America 2 more years, seemingly just another veteran finishing school, before telling his friends in 1948 that he had been offered to work on a European power station project and quietly leaving for good. No one around him, not classmates, not the Army, and not his girlfriend ever knew. But not everyone was entirely fooled. There was one person that was kind of suspicious of him. George would often visit his girlfriend's family, and they would spend some time together. He was a semi-regular presence in their home, which is exactly the kind of thing that made his cover so effective. But the mother of the girlfriend picked up one specific thing. He would never talk openly about his families. No stories about his parents, no mentions of his siblings, and nothing about where he grew up, beyond the basics, and that silence is what made her uneasy. He was so hyper-focused on blending in through standard American activities that the mother felt his, quote, regular guy persona was an overcorrected, calculated performance. He would finish his bachelor's degree in electrical engineering on February 1st, but underneath the mask, the pressure was building. Within roughly a year of the war ending, he had grown nervous about the intensifying anti-communist mood in the US and began asking Moscow to bring him home. He also turned down a job offer from the army itself. He understood how deep an American security clearance would dig and feared it would surface things from his past, like a 1930 Communist Youth League confrontation he attended, or his own arrest a year later. George secured a US passport for 6 months of travel in Europe on behalf of a company called Atlas Trading, and in October he boarded the ocean liner America in New York, bound for France. By 1948, he was already settled back in Moscow with his wife of 12 years, and soon reunited with his parents. It wasn't until 1954, 6 years after George left, and 5 years after the USSR's first successful atomic bomb test, that J. Edgar Hoover's FBI even began investigating him as a possible spy. By then, he was untouchable, a Soviet citizen with a teaching post outside Moscow. Koval wasn't the only spy, of course. There was another man named Klaus Fuchs. He gave the Soviets theoretical and design information about the atomic bomb. But George's information wasn't design level like Klaus. It was about plutonium-210 production for the neutron initiator. In that narrow front, the claim for his importance is unusually strong and specific. After George's death, Russia's Ministry of Defense stated that initiator used in the first Soviet bomb was built to specifications George provided. If that's accurate, it means the Soviets may have not had to independently work out plutonium purity, quantity, and geometry for the initiator through their own trial and error. They built to a known working spec instead of rederiving it. That's worth mentioning, since getting an initiator wrong is exactly the kind of thing that would otherwise require its own test cycle. In 2000, Russia's Ministry of Defense quietly awarded him a medal for, quote, service in military intelligence. And that same year, he gathered his students for a small gathering, and for the first time, admitted to them that he had been a Soviet spy in the 40s. And after 50 plus years of total silence, his first real disclosure wasn't to the press or historians, it was to his own students. In 2002, Russian historian Vladimir Lota published the, quote, GRU and the atomic bomb, end quote, identifying him publicly for the first time by his old code name, Delmer. George died in his Moscow apartment on January 31st, 2006, at 92. In November 2007, Vladimir Putin posthumously awarded him the Hero of the Russian Federation, Russia's highest civilian honor, publicly naming him as Delmer and crediting his role in the Soviet atomic program. Without George, the USSR would have a much more difficult time building the bomb. Toward the end of his life, his old New York classmate and friend Arnold Karmish asked him directly whether he had any regrets about what he had done. George's answer was, quote, no. When the Soviets got the bomb, it ended the American nuclear monopoly. From 1945 to 49, the US was the only country with an atomic weapon for 4 years, in which Washington's entire strategic posture and a good deal of his diplomatic leverage rested on that monopoly. Some US military and political figures during these years seriously discussed preventive strikes against Soviet nuclear facilities while the window was still open. Once the USSR tested its own bomb in August, years earlier than American intelligence had projected, which was itself a shock, that option closed permanently, and the US had to start planning for a world where it could no longer act with impunity against a nuclear-armed rival. Thank you for watching till the end. Let me know what you think about this topic in the comments below. Do you think it could have been possible for the US government to prevent this leak,